You're listening to episode 114 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Researcher Adam Lueke joins us to share his findings on how mindfulness can reduce implicit bias from his paper, Mindfulness Meditation Reduces Implicit Age and Race Bias, the role of reduced automaticity of responding. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made possible from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. Much of formal meditation practice, as it's done in secular mindfulness, involves noticing and receiving whatever is present in a non-judgmental way. That doesn't mean judgments aren't present. They may also arise in the moment and can be seen, explored, and a choice can be brought to bear about how to respond instead of react. Today's guest has researched how mindfulness, and this fundamental aspect of it, may help offset some kinds of implicit bias. Adam Lueke is a researcher interested in the effects of mindfulness in a number of domains. Currently, he is applying this research to the fields of implicit bias, discrimination, gratitude, cognitive performance, decision-making, and general social cognition. Adam is also involved with projects regarding priming, religion and morality, and consumer research. Our guest today is Adam Lueke. Adam, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And I'm particularly interested in the topic we're going to be covering today with you and some research you've done in this area. But before we get started with that, I'd like to have you tell us a little bit about your background as a researcher, your background with mindfulness.
I originally got interested in meditation in grad school, actually. I was kind of generally interested in ideas of self-control, the ability to maximize self-control as a means of... I was always interested in the idea of free will and how control could relate to free will. And I saw mindfulness as a tool to maximize your ability to control your own agency, essentially. So I started practicing it myself in grad school. And after practicing it for a while, it was serendipitous that we had social psychology meetings every week in which we would discuss current research in the field. And it would vary from subject to subject. In one of the weeks, it just so happened that one of the subjects was mindfulness and how it can improve insight problem solving. So I found that fascinating. And essentially, insight problem solving is you are given a question that seems to have an answer in which your mind will automatically come up with the answer itself. But that initial answer is wrong, and you have to creatively reorganize the information in order to find the appropriate answer. So essentially, it helps you disengage from your past associations and your tendency towards automatic responses and help you reorganize the information to arrive at the correct response. I could give you an example if you want.
Yeah, I would actually love it. I'm very curious about how closely this is to lateral thinking puzzles, and what is an example of what you're talking about. I'm very curious about that. So please, yes.
Okay. This was an experiment done by Ostafin and Kassman a couple of years before we did our first experiment. An example of an insight problem solving would be Marcia and Marjorie are born to the same mother and the same father on the same day of the same month of the same year, yet they are not twins. How can this be?
I'll let you walk the audience through it. Of course, it's not that I'm struggling with it.
I wouldn't expect you to come up with it right off the top of your head. That would be really impressive. But yeah, essentially, your mind is telling you that if they're immediately from the time that you find out that they're born to the same parents in the same day, your mind's telling you twins, 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 twins.
Right.
And then at the end, when you hear they're not twins, a lot of times people don't know where to go from there. They don't know how to restructure the problem. But if you're in a more mindful set, it allows you to disengage from that automatic answer and come up with the idea that they're part of a triplet or a quadruplet or something like that. So it allows you that loophole that those are only two. We've only mentioned two of the potential three siblings. Mm-hmm. So I found that as analogous to the potential to subvert the use of automatic stereotypes that tend to spring to mind in encountering somebody of a particular group, whatever group that might be, is every group has their stereotypes. It's an automatic association that comes to mind and that can potentially affect behavior. So I saw that in the same vein as being able to disengage from a particular solution that comes to mind that's not correct, and then you can potentially find the correct solution. So that's basically what interested me in going into seeing how mindfulness could essentially allow us to get past those automatic associations.
So there was coming together for you of your own practice, because you're curious about meditation as well as research, as well as this, and here's something really interesting. How does this help with our not always going for what's automatically coming up in our mind, not what's based on habitual thinking patterns?
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about implicit bias. Tell us a little bit about what that is, maybe from a more scientific point of view, as something you're going to study.
It's an interesting term because it's been used in a lot of different ways in the scientific field. So it can kind of be a little bit muddy, even within the scientific field, about how people use it. Essentially what it is the tendency to behave in a, say, negative or positive way towards a particular maybe group of people.
Okay, so based on, probably I imagine there are a number of factors going into bias, whether it's previous associations or societal conditioning or any number of things. Biological factors could even factor into this. So that seems to add up to quite a lot to try to surmount and get past.
Potentially, yeah, it could be. I mean, everybody essentially has a way of trying to make the world a simpler place. And we often try, or we don't even have to try to do it. Our brains automatically basically organize the information in the environment in order to figure out shortcuts for information. And that's where basically stereotypes can come into play. And those shortcuts of information are ways to try to make the world more predictable around us. And when we try to make the world more predictable around us, we can try to act according to the way that our minds are predicting the next interaction to go with whatever member from a particular group that we're interacting with, which obviously could lead to some negative consequences depending upon those types of stereotypes that you believe in. Let's put it that way.
Right. So with this paper, and it's noting this one that we're talking about now, I think it's from 2014. So it's a few years ago at this point. How did you and your co-author, how did you guys land on this topic? Had you already been talking together, and how did that come about?
Yeah, so I think the reason that I found the insight problem solving research analogous to the stereotyping idea was because my advisor at the time in grad school had been doing research already with racial differences, and he had been dealing with the implicit associations test, the IAT, quite a bit already, and had been already interested in this area and had gotten me involved in some of his research already. So through exposure to the research that he had been doing, and then to the exposure to the mindfulness literature in that social psychology meeting, uh, in that discussion group, that was what kind of just naturally seemed like a good fit of potential research avenue to go down, because no one had looked at this yet, and it was a fertile ground for research, and we thought that we would run with it.
So, tell us about the structure of the research for this paper. What did you do?
Well, we essentially recruited participants to come into the lab, and we essentially just had them, well, we had half of them essentially do, well, they listen to a mindfulness based audio recording. So it was an audio recording that's been used in previous mindfulness research projects. Essentially, it's just 10 minutes of a body scan. Essentially, the voice is directing you to pay attention to various aspects of your internal workings, your breath, the sensations of sitting against the chair, the sensations of the light coming through the window and reaching the outside of your eyes, right? The feeling of your feet on the floor and so forth, all that kind of stuff. So that was our mindfulness group. And we thought that potentially 10 minutes would be enough to alter automatic associations amongst groups. So we had our mindfulness group, and we had our control group, which listened to a different 10-minute audio tape. That audio tape was simply a narrator describing the natural landscape of an English countryside.
Okay, so nothing even vaguely overlapping any kind of mindfulness intervention.
Exactly. But you could still say that it was somewhat relaxing. So you could say that in both conditions, the participant was naturally relaxed, but the mindfulness group was specifically engaging in mindfulness, whereas the other one wasn't. It was just listening to a natural landscape. So we had the two groups do that. And then we had them do the implicit associations test, which I should probably go into description of what that is. It was originally created as a method of measuring implicit bias. That was its purpose. And it was very, very popular. It still is very, very popular. At this time, you can go to Project Implicit website, and they have a bunch of different implicit associations tests. And essentially what they do is they look at two different categories of people, usually. The idea is to see which you naturally have more positive associations with and which you tend to have less positive associations with. Mm-hmm. So those can be anything from like looking at how you associate Republicans versus Democrats, or men versus women, or Black people versus white people. And we used two implicit associations tests, the Black versus white and young people versus old people, which in general, the research has shown that white individuals and even a fair proportion of Black individuals tend to have slightly more positive associations with white folks than Black folks. And young people tend to have slightly more positive associations with young people than old people. And essentially, they do this, they find this out with the IAT by having you sort into categories, first faces. So they'll flash up either a white face or a Black face, and it'll say press the E key if the face is white, press the I key if the face is Black. And they'll get you kind of used to using both of the buttons for each of the faces. And then they'll also do the same thing for positive words or negative words. So if the word is positive, press the I key. If the word is negative, press the E key. Positive words are like love. Negative words are like hate. And then the kind of critical trials is they'll have you have to sort either say a white face or positive words with an E key, and the blackface or negative words with an I key. It measures basically how long it takes you to respond to each of the faces and words, and it also measures the amount of mistakes you get. After that, it switches it so that black is with positive words and white faces are with negative words. And then it basically compares whether it was easier for you to make the associations of white faces with positive words or black faces with positive words. Okay, so the idea being, if it's quicker for you to make an association or to categorize white faces with positive words than black faces with positive words, they defined it as if you are showing implicit bias. So I'm going to have to come back to a point about the IAT itself a little bit later, but I'll continue with that.
Yeah, please do.
So that's the general idea of the IAT. And again, research has shown that generally there tends to be a slightly more positive or quicker response when white faces are paired with positive words than when black faces are paired with positive words. The same with the young versus the elderly. So we thought that perhaps the mindfulness group wouldn't show that difference between when the white faces were with positive words than the black faces were. And the same with the young and the elderly. And that's exactly what we found. Our control groups showed slightly more positive attitudes towards white faces than black, and slightly more positive attitudes towards the young than the elderly.
Fitting in with how the test generally runs in any kinds of studies.
That's correct. Yes. So that's good because we're essentially replicating a lot of previous research in that capacity. And our sample was all young, white students. So, I mean, that's something that you would expect given those demographics as well. With the mindfulness condition, we saw a significant reduction. So there was less of a discrepancy between being able to sort white faces and black faces with the positive words. It was much closer to equilibrium, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So we found that with both the differences in categorizations between black and white and with young and old. Mm-hmm. And we applied a specific statistical analysis called the quad model, which has been used to essentially differentiate effects of the IAT, like what could be going on that's causing the differences that we're seeing in ability to categorize these faces and words, with the possibility that, well, mindfulness could be working on an automatic association level. So maybe the automatic associations of negative stereotypes that might pop up when you come across a black face, maybe those aren't as activated. Or there's the possibility that mindfulness allows you to recognize any potential negative automatic association and therefore overcome it. So that's a possibility as well. The quad model showed us there was not the overcoming of potential negative associations, but it was actually that they didn't pop up as much. So the mind actually isn't automatically activating negative associations with the elderly or with black people, at least not as strongly. So essentially the mind doesn't hold to those types of associations or stereotypes potentially as much. And potentially that means they might not use those associations or stereotypes in future behavior or even in behavior with immediate interactions. That's what the IAT is essentially designed to try to parse out. So on that note, the IAT has a lot of criticism about its reliability and validity. It is not a very reliable measure by scientific means. Essentially, if you take it one time, it will tell you that maybe you have it calls it a preference for one group or the other. So maybe it tells you have a strong preference for white people. If you were to take it again, there's a strong chance that it would say that you either have no preference whatsoever or maybe even a preference in the opposite direction. So the test-retest reliability is not great for the IAT. It also, because it explains that it measures implicit bias, essentially is claiming that it can predict individual behavior in terms of discrimination. So if you're higher on IAT scores, essentially it means you should be higher in terms of your tendency towards discriminating against a particular group. And on the individual level, the IAT is not really able to do that. Meta-analyses have essentially shown that on the aggregate level, it is very, very, very weakly able to predict any type of behavior in terms of discrimination whatsoever.
Because the conditions outside of the test setting for a very specific kind of response
Right.
is a little different than the complexities of the outside world.
Exactly. Yeah, and in terms of the validity of what the IAT even measures, it's even been shown that people who are, say, more empathic towards particular groups or feel concern for them in terms of they believe they've been downtrodden for so many odd years, those types of people have actually at times been shown to show higher negative associations as measured by the IAT. So that shouldn't happen if the IAT is actually measuring implicit bias against these particular groups. So the IAT itself isn't necessarily able to tell you if this type of behavior is going to translate into the real world. So we did do a follow-up.
Yeah, tell us about that, because you've said what you found in the first study. So the follow-up, tell us a little bit about that. What was that structure? What did you do? What did you find?
Yeah, so we essentially were wondering if this effect that we found, the ability to reduce these automatic associations, if that could potentially mean that engaging in mindfulness might reduce the tendency to be biased in behavior towards one group over another. So we replicated the same audio conditions. So again, we had an audio condition in which these people listened to the 10-minute mindfulness tape, and then we had an audio condition with the 10-minute natural landscape tape. But then we had everyone play what's called the trust game. So essentially what this is we would tell people we're giving you essentially 50 fake dollars for this game, right? And your goal of the game is to maximize the amount of money that you make throughout the game. And you do this through individual interactions that you're going to be having with people, just their faces themselves. Basically, we told them, we think that people are very good at determining trustworthiness just based on facial characteristics. So we had them basically we told them we're going to be showing you a series of faces. Each of these faces are real people that we have interacted with and gave us specific answers to questions that's going to be pertinent to this game. The game is essentially, for each face that you see, so each interaction partner that you are interacting with, you have the option of giving between $0 and $10 to. The idea being, whatever number you choose, that number will be quadrupled. So if you give $5 to this person, it will become $20. That person would, based on our interactions with them, when we ask them this question, would either take all of the money for themselves or they would give half of it back to you. So essentially, if you believe that this person is trustworthy, you're going to want to give them more money so that you can double your money. And if you think this person is untrustworthy, you don't want to give them any money because they're going to steal it all for themselves. So we essentially had them interact, quote unquote, with 150 faces, 50 of which were white, 50 of which were black, and then 50 of which were of various ethnicities, Middle Eastern, Asian, stuff like that. The idea was to make it less obvious that we were dealing with a black versus white comparison, essentially. And what we found was that throughout the course of the trust game, that the control group, so the group that had listened to the landscape audio tape, gave approximately, I think it was 33 more dollars over the course of all of the trials to white faces or white interaction partners than black interaction partners. So 33 more dollars to basically the 50 white interaction partners compared with the 50 black interaction partners. Whereas the mindfulness condition gave almost identical. I think it was within a couple of bucks of a difference between the white and black interaction partners. So now we're actually seeing more objective behavior in terms of trust, regardless of which individual you're dealing with and which group they belong to in the mindfulness condition. Whereas the control condition, the white participants that we had tended to trust the white interaction partners more. So now we're seeing, I mean, that could happen for any number of reasons. Potentially, it's the idea that they're using the stereotype of criminal, perhaps, with black folks. And because of that, they think that potentially they're going to get their money stolen. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's a general in-group favoritism, which tends to happen within most groups. But regardless of the reasons why, what we're actually finding is that the mindfulness condition is essentially weeding out extraneous information, weeding out the potential use of maybe stereotypes or in-group favoritism, and treating every person as an individual, I think, which is, I think, a really awesome finding, that mindfulness helps you deal with what's in front of you in a more objective way and on an individual to individual basis.
Yeah, I find that fascinating and thank you for bringing the follow-up study too, because the first is, here's what we're seeing with just base influence on implicit bias, understanding that there are no perfect studies. It's still, there's an indication here. There's something interesting. With a follow-up, then it's that additional step of, and here's how that attenuation of automatic responses, automaticity, might be influenced in behaviors and choices that people
That's right.
That's what I really find interesting. So I'm curious, for you, having done this and perhaps having thought about it for a while, what are some of the implications? Do you see a chance that there could be some wider shifting based on meditation practices?
Well, yeah, I mean, essentially, I kind of mentioned before, especially when we meet people that we don't know, strangers, that's when we're really looking to grasp at whatever predictive information that we can find. And that's when we tend to grab a hold of stereotypes. And we use those stereotypes to try to simplify our world. When we know the individuals well enough and we know a bit about their personality, these kinds of things don't come into play as much, right? Mm-hmm. You don't tend to work off of these automatic responses or these stereotypes. You deal with what you know about the person. But when you're dealing with strangers, you're more apt to fall back on these automatic types of associations, and therefore treat people differently based on your preconceived notions or based on the way that you've been kind of conditioned through your general experiences. Mindfulness allows people, I believe, given that what we've seen and in general, looking at the research, mindfulness allows us more cognitive flexibility and to disengage from a lot of these previously established associations. And it allows us to engage with people in a more objective way and probably give them the benefit of the doubt rather than necessarily assuming that there potentially could be negative motivation on their part or a negative interaction possible on their part.
Or positive as well. And going
That's right. Yeah.
Because there is also, I can imagine, a reflexive acceptance that may not be warranted in the same way that the negative reaction may not be warranted.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you think about the tendency to have more favorable attitudes towards in-group members, potentially that, to your point, might make you think that one of your in-group members, however you're defining your in-group, might, even if it's a stranger, might be more generous or more amicable or whatever that might be. And that might not be the case either because you don't know them and you don't know their personality. So maybe it would keep you from being a little bit more, maybe able to be taken advantage of? I'm not sure. That could be an interesting area for future research. I'm not sure about that one.
That was one of the implications I was thinking of with, for example, groups that are in communities that are rather insular, or through time and over the course of years, there are some shifts in people's behaviors and how they treat one another. And I think about some abuses of privilege for those who are in power in a particular in-group, and whether that's on a small cult-like setting or more broadly in society, that there is this acceptance of that which from anyone else would be completely unacceptable.
Right. Yeah. So it might actually help you better recognize the relationship that you have with people around you and not allow yourself to be subjected to these kinds of negative behaviors against you, and maybe stand up against them a little bit better. That's very possible and very interesting possibility.
Adam, I'm wondering, you've had a number of other papers, and I'm wondering if there's any of that you'd like to share with the listeners, or if there's anything else that you want to just mention.
Well, I've actually done a couple of other papers with mindfulness. Those are more in the cognitive domain. So kind of similar to the insight problem solving, we also found that it helps analytical problem solving. So that's more logical, that the answer is obvious if you allow yourself to go through the process of rationally figuring out the steps to get to the correct answer, but often has an intuitive response instead. That, like, here's a quick example. A bat and a ball together costs $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
See, this is a math problem. I can't do math in my head. That's my excuse. I'm sticking with it.
Okay. Well, most people immediately say 10 cents. That's the intuitive answer, right? Even though what's stated is that the bat is $1 more than the ball. So if the ball was 10 cents, the bat would have to be $1.10 together, meaning that they'd equal $1.20.
Yep.
So analytically, mindfulness helps you disengage from that intuitive answer and logically go to your next, your logical progression, and see that the ball is actually 5 cents. The bat's $1.05, thus being $1 more than the ball, and together being $1.10. So that's interesting, something to know. More, it helps you in multiple domains of problem solving. So that's
you're
cool.
Sneaking in math for one thing.
Yes. I'm just trying to hit all of the listeners' interests here. So and then one quick aside, another project that my wife and I actually just finished was that it helps. We looked at verbal memory using neuropsychological tests, and we found that mindfulness actually improves verbal memory through increased encoding of verbal information. So that's really interesting as well. So if you want to improve your verbal memory, maybe mindfulness is for you.
Very interesting. So for those of you who are listening to this podcast, you may recall that a few episodes ago, I had a guest who had a paper that found there was no difference between a mindfulness and an active control, and how it works with critical thinking, which is in a similar territory to what Adam, you and I are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I found interesting, this is why I brought it up earlier in our conversation, is that your active control group was something that wasn't even in the territory of an active meditation. It was something that was completely different. And that was one of the challenges I found with that other study, is that the control, the not meditation intervention, was actually meditation. It was mindfulness of breath.
Oh,
It wasn't a repeated gradual. It was just, no, you have this one thing, and that's our control. Yeah. And to the credit, and this is not an admonishment or anything of that kind. There was that acknowledgement in the paper itself of, it may be that the sham was just very close to the quote unquote real control. So I really appreciate that you did something that was different. It wasn't something that could be mistaken for any kind of, because it didn't do the same thing, although you, and also acknowledged, could be calming, could be relaxing, and those can have elements as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Well, for those of you who are interested in finding out more about this, I'll be linking at least the paper we've been speaking about today on the episode page, as well as link to more information about Adam and his work. Our guest today, Adam Lueke. Adam, thanks so much for being here. Very interesting conversation.
Absolutely. It was wonderful. Thank you very much, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.